To add my personal congratulations to all the award winners. Okay, let's get started with this conference and let's hear some, I'm sure you're all waiting to hear what our plenary speakers have got to say, and I'm quite excited myself. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jose Villalon. Jose is originally born in Cuba, but he was raised in Arkansas, I was going to say, in the USA. He has a Master of Science from the University of Washington, Seattle, in fish nutrition. He then spent 26 years traveling around West Indies, Ecuador, and Mexico, working in the private shrimp production industry. I'll translate that for our Australians, the prawn farming industry. Through a range of shrimp farms, shrimp feeds, and hatcheries. He then moved on to get into areas that are most relevant to what he's talking about today. He spent 6 years in Washington, D.C., working for the World Wildlife Fund, creating and working on the environmental and social standards for 12 species used in aquaculture. And he was one of the founders of the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, of which I'm sure most of you are familiar. Then for 1 year, he has moved now to the Netherlands, and he currently works as a corporate sustainability director for Nutrico. And he's a highly qualified person, and we're really looking forward to hear what he has to say today. So I'd like to invite Jose to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. For me, it's an honor to be able to, on behalf of Skirting, address you this morning and share with you some of my thoughts on why I think aquaculture is at a tipping point to be able to model itself potentially as the future of how protein should be farmed. And I'd like to do that with using three optics. One is first setting the stage, including resource limitations and the national security issues that we'll be facing in the next 40 years. And then moving on to what I think we all understand as aquaculture being part of that solution, and specifically its environmental efficiency to address those rising food needs. And then finally, I would like to just end it with how aquaculture can take a leading role, a leading strategic position in addressing food security in a sustainable way through initiatives like standards and certification, initiatives like the Global Salmon Initiative, and continuous improvement platforms that already exist out there. So if I may, I'd like to start with the trends that we should start looking, and we all have heard before. Global population is going to increase from 7 billion to 9.3 billion in the next 36 years. About 3 billion additional people will move into the middle class sector, demanding more quality protein and more food. This is setting the stage for food to have to double production in the next 40 years. And most of this drive is going to come from the emerging economies, not from the industrialized nations. It's estimated that more food is going to be needed to be produced in the next 4 decades than the preceding 8,000 years together. So the question is, how are we going to do this on a finite planet? WWF every 2 years produces a Living Planet report. 2 years ago in 2012, they stated that we were already consuming 1.5 planet Earth's worth of natural resources. And that if businesses continue as usual, by mid-2030, a mere 15 years from now, we'll be consuming 2 planet Earths. So how are we going to do that if we're expected to double food production in the same period of time? How are we going to be able to double that food production and at the same time cut by half the environmental footprint? Let's take a look a little bit at what we have now and some of the constrained resources that we're seeing. 38% of the land area on this planet is dedicated to food production, either directly for human consumption or to produce grains for animal feed. 38%. So let's look at the next series of 5 slides quickly to show what else is available for potential food production. 2% is in cities. 5% are in deserts. 18% in mountain, rivers, lakes, and streams. 14% are already reserved in national and regional parks around the world. That leaves 24% more for food production. But the original 38% wasn't chosen randomly. It was chosen because it was fertile and accessible. So it's highly unlikely that this 24% is going to doubling food production. And aquaculture could step up, done responsibly, and occupy the 75% of the planet's surface that is of water. Already, agriculture takes 70% of all fresh water for human consumption, is absorbing 70% of that fresh water agriculture. And that's a constrained resource now. If you look at this drought map of the United States last year, almost all southwest, the lower left corner of the states was in a drought. Almost a third of the area of the United States in the brown area are demonstrating lack of rainfall. This is a constrained resource as well. This is going to lead to water rationing, to agricultural decrease in output, energy generation reductions, and political bickering. Already, if you look at the world headlines, they're full of how the climate change is affecting constrained resources like water and food. As a matter of fact, the drought of 2010 that caused the peak in world wheat prices was the generator of Arab Spring. You know, the Western press reported that it was the hunger for democracy, which partly it was so. But the real cause of Arab Spring, or one of the main drivers of Arab Spring, was the lack of food availability and cost of food. If you look at this map over the last decade or two, in the inset, it's more than a decade. Here, it's a decade. Just tracking world index food prices. And the vertical lines correspond to individual world conflicts. The numbers in parentheses are the actual death tolls of those world conflicts. So this is the food riots based on food pricing. So I would argue, as many of you will agree, that food security is in fact national security. You know, food is cheap, but every night, 870 million people go to bed every night with hunger. So now I'd like to shift gears to, I think, what we all know, how aquaculture can actually play a part, a viable tool in the tool chest to address food security issues. Over the past several decades, it's been under a tremendous societal scrutiny, criticism, and I think the industry over time has reacted positively. I would argue that it has earned not only the right to be at the table to address food security issues, but to lead in that discussion from a sustainability perspective. It's the only center plate protein food sector that, as a reaction, has created a plethora of environmental and social standards for which someone can demonstrate independently its environmental responsibility. But before we go into what some of these tools are, I'd like to kind of demonstrate the environmental efficiency. And many of you don't need to be convinced of this and are leading in describing this. But if we look at the yields, for edible yields, in some cases, twice of other food producing, land animal producing protein. Also on the energy and protein retention efficiency, no one can stand near aquaculture in that regard. Almost 3 times or at least double the efficiency and retention of energy and protein. When you look at feed conversion ratios, and you see how salmon is at 1.15 and you're looking at pork near 3. I didn't put beef up there, but if I would have, red meat is 10 to 1 feed conversion ratio compared to 1 or 1.5 for shrimp, 1.1 for salmon. On the use of irrigation water, salmon and chicken are much lower than beef and pork. Before even getting there, if you looked at it from a commodity grain perspective, 13 kilos of grain is required to produce 1 kilo of finfish, compared to 60 kilos of grain, commodity grain, for 1 kilo of beef. And then when you look at the environmental or greenhouse gas emission CO2 equivalency, it's 7 to 1 over beef. Or beef is 7 to 1 over farm seafood. So the mantra of tomorrow, and what we should pick up on, is how to produce more with less to be able to produce responsibly on this planet. Aquaculture should not be competing with aquaculture. I would argue it shouldn't even be competing with wild seafood. The rivals here is poultry, pork, and beef. That's where the competition is, to ensure that over the next 40 years we will be able to double production through demand. As the senator already stated, yes, we've already, and Graham, I think, stated, we already surpassed red meat production last year, a couple of years ago, but we're still trailing behind pork and poultry. And this is where we need to focus our efforts moving forward in this tipping point moment. The famous Harvard Business School professor on business strategy, Michael Porter, said, the worst strategy is trying to compete with your rivals on the same dimension. The best strategy for success is competing with your rivals on a unique dimensions. And I argue that the aquaculture industry is perfectly poised to do this. With their environmental efficiency, key performance indicators that we just saw, how do you compete with beef and pork and poultry? We're so much better. It's unique. But it's not only that. We can also compete, at least in the global market, because it's not a solution to everything. But in the global market, we can compete with certification to third-party standards, to third-party certification, demonstrating environmental responsibility and performance. You know, the mantra of tomorrow, it's easy to do more with less. It's easy to say, when you're sitting around having a cocktail that you need to double food production and we need to half the environmental footprint? It's easy to say, hard to do, but it is possible. Look at this graph of the last 2 decades production of salmon in Norway, how it's gone up. At the same time, the reduction of the inclusion of fish meal and fish oil in the diet, both fish meal and fish oil being constrained resources of environmental sensitivity as being at the bottom of the food chain in the ocean for ocean health. And yet, the industry has increased production significantly, exponentially, over 2 decades, and significantly decreased fish meal and fish oil inclusion rates. Yes, soybean and other commodity grains increasing, but there are ways to demonstrate of doing that responsibly, of producing those grains responsibly. So over the last 2 decades, aquaculture has been under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of criticism. It's really admirable in the way that the industry has reacted. It has been reactive. Some of that criticism, a lot of it maybe, was well justified. But as the industry reacted in addressing those issues, and then went a step further to develop a plethora of standards to demonstrate independently that it is operating responsibly, no other center plate protein industry has done this. If you consider all of the aquaculture standards that are available, like food safety, animal welfare, environmental, social, organic, there's over 30. Yes, it's confusing and it's expensive. It can be. But there's also a positive side to it because it does give us that unique edge. Some rejected the unconstructiveness of having a lot of standards available and the expense of getting certified. But I think they're missing a little bit the opportunity of diving into this. About in 2008, 2006, the World Wildlife Fund embarked on an ambitious program called the Aquaculture Dialogues. Many of you have heard of it. It took over 8 years to develop standards for 9 commodity farm fish, farm seafood. Took over 8 years, almost $7 million to do this. 2,200 people around the world involved in the process of creating environmental and social standards. It was the first aquaculture standard to be created under the rigorous ICL code guidelines, which happen to be the highest code or guidelines for creating standards, including guidelines for creating standards like being transparent, consensus-driven, multi-stakeholder, all-inclusive, all of that. These are just a few of the NGOs that were involved and some of the major private industries that were involved in the process. And now the standards were completed and handed over to the Independent Aquaculture Stewardship Council. Many argued against it. They said, why does it take so long? Why is it so expensive to create environmental credible standards? But they failed to understand the real value proposition of what the aquaculture dialogues were all about. It was much more than just creating credible standards in a very credible way. It was more. It was identifying what the key impacts were per species and trying to identify how to address those. And so it became much more than just creating standards. It became a roadmap for how a producer can produce responsibly. It also identified all the gaps, or much of the gaps in the knowledge, in the science, and where there was controversy in the science, it opened the debate to resolve the issues. And at the end of the day, it was finished and handed over to the ASC, which is currently certifying. And then the World Fish Center and Conservation International, a major global NGO, produced a life cycle assessment report last year that was very forceful in demonstrating how seafood, farm seafood, performed better than terrestrial animal food on a variety of environmental indicators, including greenhouse gas emissions, energy, freshwater use. It was bringing science to the table, and frankly, it was a very bold position by Conservation International and World Fish Center to demonstrate that of all the center plate protein choices, aquaculture was probably the most environmental friendly. Private industry also has a seminal role to play in sustainable development of aquaculture. It's in their best interest, it's in their bottom line interest to do so. A great example of this was last year in Norway, the announcement of the Global Salmon Initiative. The GSI is a platform where the top 15 salmon farmers in the world came together, joined forces to work in a pre-competitive way and transparently to address the outstanding issues that remain. Because we still have outstanding issues in aquaculture, we'll have to agree. And the GSI banded together at 70% of global production is represented at the table, working together, pre-competitive to address sea lice infestation, sustainable feeds, farm biosecurity, and they made a target that by 2020 they would be ASC certified. That is ambitious. This is one of the gold standards out there. Other standards can be used as a stepping-wise approach to demonstrate to the world one's journey through sustainability. But achieving gold ASC compliance is quite ambitious. I think the largest impact that the GSI will have will be how other species groups react to it. And already some shrimp farmers are banding together to discuss how they can also form a similar platform. And I understand that the cacao industry and the chocolate industry is doing similar explorations. So moving on to continuous improvement, because this is going to be where we demonstrate the maturity of the industry and our social license to operate. There are already out there several platforms. These are just 3 of them. The Sustainability Consortium, the Food, the Consumers Goods Forum. These are already existing platforms that are dedicated, are designed to bring together retailer and food service industries and help their supply chain achieve levels of sustainability. And so if I can, I'd just like to briefly go over on the Sustainability Consortium, they have 90 retailers around the world, and they're improving the environmental and social performance of their supply chain. Possibly more importantly is the Consumer Goods Forum. Look at that, 400 retailers and food service members represented by 70 countries, 2.5 trillion euros in annual sales. For you farmers in the audience, I argue that every one of your clients, directly or indirectly, is in this group. And just take a minute to read the yellow text on the right side of that column. One of their pillars is to educate the retailers and food service on the sustainability attributes of the supply chain. I would argue that the GSI, the Global Salmon Initiative, and other initiatives that may spring up as a result of the GSI, have a place at the table to highlight, to showcase the environmental efficiency of aquaculture, and to demonstrate how we have this plethora of environmental and social standards that can demonstrate to the independently how we are performing environmentally and socially. So we're in this together. We can no longer afford to be stereotyped by characteristics of different stakeholder groups. The darkest moments lead to the brightest moments. I would embrace entering the darkness to search solutions to our outstanding problems, and would argue that this will lead the way to allow us to double production in aquaculture by 2050 and demonstrate that we are doing so responsibly so that the future food that is necessary to feed that surging demand can be done on a finite planet responsibly. Thank you very much.